Stop trying to be insurance famous and just have real positive impact. Leave your peers better than you found them.
Hi, my name is Nick Berry, and I'm the demand gen manager at Canopy Connect, and this is Connected Conversations in Insurance. Today, I've got my friend and internet friend, James Jenkins, the host of Agency Freedom Podcast and the owner and founder at RiskWell in McKinney, Texas. James, appreciate you taking some time to record a session with me and
Yeah,
look
man.
forward to just the conversation.
Yeah, it should be a lot of fun.
Okay. So the whole reason I wanted to have you on is, you're one of few agency owners who's got a podcast and you record a podcast, 200 episodes. My first attempt at a podcast at about 20. I was like, this is too much.
Yeah, it is a lot.
What was your goal?
My goal at the beginning was to get Jason Cass off my back because I had no intention of launching a podcast. This was back in the spring of 2021. We went to BrainShare, believe it was in San Antonio that year, and lots of conversations happened then. And I was doing a lot of video content production. I had been a guest on several other podcasts, the Insurance Guys with Bradley and Scott, and Ryan Hanley's show, and David Carruthers with Power Producers, and a couple of others. And apparently the numbers on the episodes that I was on were substantially higher than average. Something about my episodes was attracting a good audience. And Cass approached me in the spring of 21, was like, dude, you need to launch a podcast. You've got a great voice. You're a loud, bold person who doesn't have soft opinions. Everything you have is a strong opinion. And people like that in a podcast host. So you need to do a podcast. And I told him flatly, no, I'm not doing a podcast. I have a 2-year-old insurance agency that I've started from scratch, and we're growing 100% every year. There's no way I'm doing a podcast. That's way too much work. And he came back again, was like, dude, I'm serious. You need to do a podcast. Let me put you in touch with my production team, yada, yada. We'll handle all the back end. All you do is record episodes. I'm like, what do I even talk about, man? What if I'm doing a podcast? What do I talk about? He's like, I don't know. Talk about whatever you want. What isn't being said that should be said? And I was like, oh, well, when you put it like that, maybe I do want to do a podcast. I wasn't thinking about it that way. Like, what's the message that people need to be hearing that they're not currently hearing? I used to be a farmer's agent. I was captive. I left captivity. Now have freedom. I don't really hear anybody talking about that. How you go from captive to independent. Yeah, I don't think anybody's really talking about that. Certainly not in a podcast. Okay, I'll do that. And it started out as an origin story of sorts. I literally just told people, here's what we did. Here's what we did at RiskWell. Here's how it all came about. Here's how I left the captive world. Here's how I went independent. And here's what I'm doing now that I'm independent. And it was just a whole bunch of sharing experiences, kind of pointing out warning signs. There's a landmine buried right there. Don't step on it. That sort of thing. And after about 50 episodes or so, we kind of ran out of that line of talking about here's how you do the independent thing. And at the first year anniversary, we started pivoting towards just freedom in general. Here's how you pursue freedom in your agency: freedom in staffing, freedom in tech stack, freedom in operations, freedom in sales and marketing, freedom in branding, freedom in the way that you interact with your carrier relationships and whatnot. Really became a lot more of a holistic idea of discussing freedom. And in that situation, I found a lot more interesting things to get into. A lot of guests, a lot of vendors, CEOs, and carrier executives, and insurtech founders, and people doing really cool stuff. Honestly, more than anything, it was indulging my curiosity to talk to interesting people that were doing interesting things with their time and impacting our industry. And kind of like what you started off this episode with. You told me we don't really have an agenda. We're just trying to talk to interesting people doing interesting things. And apparently you think I'm interesting. You invited me on, and I've been on your side of the microphone 200 times. So I totally get it. You just want a good episode. You want your audience to, pick up one or two tidbits that makes them go, oh, okay. And they do something with it and they become better because of listening to your show.
Yep.
So there you go. That's a rambling answer, but I think I
Great.
got an answer in there somewhere.
Yeah. Um, Now, I'm a marketer. I have a lot of strong opinions. I
Hmm.
think podcasting is still the wild, wild west, and there's tons of opportunity out there for businesses, for
Yeah.
individuals, for creators, whatever it is. Now, let's talk as an agency owner. Having that podcast, how has that impacted your business on the agency side? Even though the people listening
Hmm.
probably aren't the people buying and coming to Risk, how
Yeah.
has that impacted your business?
Well, I think your question leads us to a very interesting point when we're talking about the nuts and bolts of what does it mean to do a podcast and why would you do a podcast? The very first question is, who is your audience? When you're thinking, do I do a podcast or do I not do a podcast? Is it going to be something that I use to market my business? Is it going to be something that I am shadow marketing, as I call it, where you're not actively marketing your business? You're not talking about insurance, but just from the fact that you are interviewing someone and asking them questions, you are receiving reputation by association. And even if you're not actively talking about my insurance agency's doing XYZ, people are becoming aware of you because you are the host of a podcast. And in 2024 and 2025 and beyond, that means that you are seen as some sort of authority, as some sort of thought leader. I hate the word influencer, hate it so much. I will never refer to myself as an influencer. All I think of when I hear influencer is the Kardashians. And it's like, shoot me in the head if that's me. I don't want that. But the audience question has got to be your first question. When you're thinking about, do I do a podcast or not? You got to answer the audience question, because if the entire show isn't designed from scratch around your target audience, if the branding, if the marketing, if the guest, if the question flow, if your research, if the shtick isn't targeted for your audience and relevant to them, it's going to suck. It's going to be a bad podcast. And one of the most common sins, if you want to call it that we've seen in the insurance industry in particular, is people that come in think, oh, I'm going to be a podcast host. Hey, everybody, I've got a podcast. Listen to my podcast. But they haven't put any work into branding and being specific enough to give anybody a reason to listen. Last time I checked, you can only listen to one thing at a time. Our brains don't work well listening to two things at a time. As humans, we're not wired that way. So if someone is listening to my show, Agency Freedom, they are, by definition, not listening to any other show at that moment. They might be driving a vehicle, they might be on their back porch, they might be in the shower. They who knows where they are, they might be doing something else, but they're not listening to anything else or watching it. If you're on the YouTube channel, and we get a lot more on YouTube than I thought we would. We have, you know, not thousands, but definitely, dozens or hundreds of listens or watches to our video podcast episodes. I don't ever really talk about it other than just, hey, those of you watching on YouTube, hi, you get to see my face.
Yeah.
All of that, it comes back to the audience. And in my opinion, there's two main categories of podcast that you can do. You can either have an industry focused podcast, or you can have a local, or to use the it word right now, hyper local podcast that is geared towards a specific geography rather than a specific industry.
Yep.
I started the Agents Freedom podcast specific for insurance agents and people that own insurance agencies, producers, CSRs, agency principals. If that's not you, you probably don't get that much out of it. If you're just an entrepreneur wonk and you like listening to business podcasts, the NPR, how I built this kind of thing, it's going to be interesting, but a lot of it's going to be irrelevant because There's certain things that we talk about that are very specific to the practice of insurance, and being either a producer or a principal. And if you're not a producer or a principal, you probably don't care about most of what I'm talking about. But
Or
our McKinney podcast, I have a hyperlocal podcast that we run on the other side of this wall back here. It's a dedicated studio. And once a month, we block record 4 or 5 episodes every month. And it's as local gets. I've had everybody on from the city. We've had the mayor, the city manager, the president of the chamber, city council. We've had economic development. We've had lots of business owners and nonprofit leaders and people of substance in the community. One of the things that Fred, my co-host, I recruited to be my co-host, he's a friend of mine who's a very well-known local photographer. And one of the things that I told him was, the only rule is if it's not happening in McKinney, it's not on the McKinney podcast. But the second rule is, because there's only, I say that's the only rule, but for Fred and I, the second rule is never ever talk about your business. Never ever ever talk about your business. Because the moment you start talking about your business, everybody gets the idea that this whole thing is one elaborate marketing scheme, and you lose credibility in a huge way the moment you start pitching products or pitching your service.
yep,
And Fred and I made an agreement together that neither one of us would ever market our business. We can talk about it, but it's contextualized in whatever the conversation is about a team member or a challenging situation with a client. It's impossible to not talk about what happens here if you're talking to me, because I spend more time here than I spend at my house. During my awake hours, I spend more time in this room where I'm standing right now than any other place on earth. So of course it's going to come up in conversation. That
dude,
branched into my own sub questions there. Sorry.
I've been hammering on people for years that the local podcast, because local radio is dead, and I love radio. I love print and I love radio. Both are dead or dying. I've been saying for years, why aren't insurance agency owners go into the local radio station and be like, "Let me use your studio and bring in guests and record in your studio on a podcast." I and even approach the manager and be like, "Hey, listen, I just want the audio files. I will run it as my podcast. You guys can run it as show content for the 3 o'clock in the afternoon dead time." These local radio stations already have the infrastructure. They
Yep.
have the mics, they have the recording equipment. It's all there. Going and building out a studio in your office is kind of crazy.
It is. And I never said I wasn't crazy.
No, no, but crazy is good.
It's
But
the
like,
most James Jenkins thing I could think of, to build a 4-person podcast studio in my insurance office.
yeah, but it's I, there's this feeling I've had about this forever about, an insurance agency, you are central to the community. Your agency is part of the community. If you
Yep,
can create and just have conversations with the civic leaders, with the business leaders, with the school board members, with the
yep,
people that are important in your community, and just have one-on-one, two-on-one, two-on-two conversations about what's going on in the community, it'll just drive more business, period. That 5-hour block you have is way better than going to a networking lunch.
yep. It really is.
Now let's
Yeah,
talk.
because I mean, in our the McKinney podcast, our hyperlocal expression, the relationships that have been built there, you can't buy. The only way you get them is by having meaningful FaceTime with people that are in positions of authority and influence. And it's just what's happened in the last 6 months. The number of times I've been out and about in the community and somebody's been like, "Hey, James, love the podcast." I'm like, "Awesome. Thanks for the support, whoever you are.
Right?
Give me
You
a
and I are
moment,
both
please."
old enough to remember the local
I
celebrities of newscasters.
Mhm. And
Nobody
Anchorman.
watches the anchorman and the weatherman and the sports guy.
Yeah.
And so if you can become that and kind of make that connection, you just win.
One our part of our long term here is getting in the right circles and starting to get the MC invitations where we're, moderating panels for different organizations, where we're emceeing something that the city puts on or the chamber puts on or whatever. That's a big part of my goal, because obviously that leads credibility to the podcast, because I get to be in front of an audience, many of whom probably don't listen to the podcast. But once you get credibility, lots of other opportunities come along. And it took us 6 months, but last week we closed our first piece of business that came as a direct result of the podcast. And we've still never talked about RiskWell on the McKinney podcast. We've never said, hey, get a quote. We've never said, hey, we'd love to be your representation. We'd love to take you to market and see what's out there. Never once. We're never going to.
Yeah.
But we wrote it. It wasn't huge, but it was a couple $1,000s in revenue from something that came from a guest of the podcast. Hey, you need to talk to so and so. And I called so and so. They said you were calling. And yeah, here's all my stuff. I need you to handle this for us. Our agent is dead on arrival. We can't get a hold of them for anything. They're not getting back to us, and we need this done right now. Can you help us? Sure, we can help. And obviously, you and I love that sort of thing, where someone's pre-sold before you even talk to them. They're already buying from you, and that's the podcast effect.
Yeah. Now, this is how I approached my first podcast and this second podcast. How did you approach getting your first guests?
I went out to the organizations that are big time stakeholders in the community. For us, it was Visit McKinney, which is the city's tourism organization. It was Economic Development Corporation, Chamber of Commerce, and our local newspaper, Community Impact Newspaper. They're based out of Austin. There is a very prominent nonprofit organization called One Heart McKinney. And I went out to all five of them and said, we're launching a podcast. Here's the vision. Here's what we're going to do. I want your organization to be a in-kind partner. I'm not asking you for any money. I'm funding the whole thing myself out of my pocket. I'm not asking anybody for money ever. This is what we're going to do. Do you want to do it with us? What that means is you make guest suggestions. You share our content on your social channels. You give us ideas for topics that we should talk about on the podcast, and you give us access to the right places in town to get the right information in front of the citizens of McKinney, because there's a lot of things that government organizations can't do, can't say, can't support, or be against, that private citizens certainly can. And it's very useful from a hyperlocal podcast perspective. It's very useful for these governmental and paragovernmental organizations to have someone like me and Fred that they can say, hey, we'd like to have so and so come on your show and talk about such and such. And we'd really appreciate if you help get the word out about blah, blah, blah. Like, there was a bond issue on the ballot here in McKinney. There was a couple of propositions on the ballot for term limits of city council and mayor. And I had the mayor on for episode 1 of the podcast back several months ago. Can you help us out? And I was like, sure, I'd be happy to help you out, but I'm going to get the other side involved too. And I personally supported the proposition, and then it ended up failing 52-48. It was a really close thing. I reached out to the guy who's leading the opposition to Prop A on the ballot, and I called him up and was like, hey, I'm James. I'm doing the McKinney podcast. You probably haven't heard of us, which, by the way, assume nobody's heard of you.
Mhm.
Always assume nobody's heard of you. Because then if they have heard of you, you go, oh, cool. Thanks for the support. Love it. Yes, I'm sure you're a listener, right? And they're like, no, I haven't heard of you. Like, who are you? You're not a celebrity.
Right.
Like, always assume that people are a bigger deal than you are. That's one of my default settings, is just assume that someone's a bigger deal than I am.
Yeah.
And I reached out to him, told him who I was, and said, I want to call you for my podcast board, and I want to have an interview. And I'm going to ask you these 3 questions. And then I'm going to get the mayor on the phone and ask him the same 3 questions. And then we're going to pass the episode around and see what happens. And we did, and it was great. It's by far our biggest downloaded episode. A couple thousand people have heard that episode. And we're a brand new podcast. For us to have 4 figures downloads on any episode, I mean, I could have Tiger Woods on the podcast and be hard pressed to have thousands of downloads
Right.
for a brand new podcast.
Yep.
Because I mean, Apple and Spotify don't even know we exist at this point.
Yeah.
So the problem with a hyperlocal podcast is there is no mass effect event. There is no parabolic growth curve. There's no way you're going to explode in popularity and get, 10,000 downloads overnight. It's simply impossible. The math isn't there. You're never going to have more than a few hundred downloads for an episode. And getting your head wrapped around that, like if you get 30 or 40 listens to an episode early on, cool. You got 30 or 40 downloads.
Right?
Better than zero.
Well, and I like the analogy I saw a while ago. When you do something and you share it online and you get 200 people, that's a small theater.
Yeah.
I'm happy with 50 people seeing my stuff. If I
Yeah.
can get 300 people, I'm ecstatic. Especially, for me in the insurance space, I only have 60,000 people that are ever even going to be interested in what I do.
Yeah.
To get
Yep.
300 of them to see what I do, I'm ecstatic and happy. I think a lot of people like same thing with like YouTube videos and stuff like that. People like my YouTube videos for the marketing stuff that I run my mouth about. Somebody asked me, "Well, why do you do these? You only get 45 views." I'm like, "There's only 60,000 licensed people in the world who care about marketing for insurance agencies. I'm
Yep.
cool."
You're not wrong. And for me, for the hardest part for me wrapping my head around performance of the podcast is with agency freedom, in a typical month, I'll have somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 listeners. It's just a regular the crowd, it leveled off a long time ago. I have around 2,000 listeners, and that's probably the only audience I'm ever gonna have because I don't spend a single dollar promoting it. I'm not trying to be famous anymore. I was trying to be famous for a while, and then I decided that was stupid, and I just try to have impact and be a person of substance. Um, Billy Williams coined the term insurance famous, and I heard that episode with him and Ryan Hanley. This has been probably 2.5 years ago now, and I'm just like, "Oh, shoot, that's me." And inside my own head, we all know, inside our own heads, is like, "I'd like to be insurance famous." Sure. My wife was like, "That's so dumb." Like, "Do you sell a single dollar of premium to anyone who's listening to your insurance podcast?" "No." He's like, "Do you provide for our family in any way by being insurance famous on your podcast?" I was like, "No." He's like, "Okay."
Right.
And you know how wives are.
Mhm.
And she just lowers her chin, was like, "Yeah, being insurance famous is dumb. You don't need to be insurance famous." And I was already thinking that inside my head. It was like, it was almost freeing at that point. It's
Yeah.
like, stop trying to be insurance famous and just have real positive impact. Leave your peers better than you found them. And I mean, the podcast was less than 6 months old at that point. So the timing could not have been better for Billy to say that.
Yeah. He's not wrong. I find myself doing the same thing and going, "Why am I staying up till 3 o'clock in the morning doing this stuff?" Some of it does have impact,
Yeah.
but I have no desire to be insurance famous. I wanna help my friends.
I realized I didn't finish my thought there on because I was drawing a comparison between agency freedom and the McKinney podcast. You know, in the first month of the McKinney podcast, we had a total between 4 episodes, a total of less than 500 downloads. And then I'm going back and thinking, yeah, when agency freedom started, I think we had like 70 downloads for the first episode, and then it blew up, and we had like 2,000 downloads the second episode because word got out. But just having the comparison of, yeah, we've had 32 downloads on this episode in the first week that it was released. It's like, ugh, that feels like such a failure. Like only 32 downloads. But then remembering those are 32 people that live in my city that have lives and jobs and whatnot. Those are 32 neighbors and fellow citizens. Okay. 32 downloads on the McKinney podcast means a heck of a lot more than 32 downloads or 320 downloads on Agency Freedom.
You're right. Now, how are you distributing? and getting the podcast into the world
Mhm.
to where local people are consuming it.
We have a good production company. Shout out to Sarah Nicholas and her team at podsquad.fm. They are an end-to-end production company. I give them the raw video and raw audio, and they run with it and do their thing. They run AI scripting through the episode and come out with key quotes, come out with links, come out with summaries, bullet points. They publish to the streaming platforms. I think there's 8 of them they publish to. The main 3 are always gonna be Apple and well, I should say main 4. Apple, Spotify, Amazon, and iHeartRadio are probably the biggest 4 platforms. Pandora, but Pandora, I think, peaked 15 years ago. Pandora's not really a thing anymore.
There's a bar that uses it for their streaming overhead, and I'm like, "Wait a second, I thought they went out of business." Right.
Was it
Oh,
like a Zen or something like that, where
yeah,
it's like, they haven't made that device in a decade or whatever?
yeah. So, do you guys do anything on social? Anything do you
Yeah,
have
we've
email
got
list?
social channels, we've got YouTube. I lean on my production team because at the end of the day, I don't have time to do it myself. Do it myself, it wouldn't exist. I run an insurance agency. I've got 9 team members. Our monthly revenue target for 2025 is 125 grand in revenue a month. You can do the basic math and realize that is 1.5 in top line rev for 25. And that's all I'm thinking about is how do I hit our revenue target? How do I hit our profit target? How do I make sure my team is happy and healthy and that they feel valued and cared for, that they feel that their career is going somewhere exciting and special? That's where my head's at.
Yeah,
I've got a post about the podcast is not on my radar at all. And if I didn't have a good production team behind me, I mean, I pay them almost $1,000 a month and I don't have any ROI from that. That's just the cost of getting the word out. I will never have actual profit from the agency freedom. I might have profit someday, like net profit from McKinney Podcast a year or 2 from now. But when you factor in time value of money, it's a losing operation for sure.
yeah. Well, I think too many business owners fail to realize that some of this stuff that we do is not gonna be an ROI positive event and work.
Yeah, it's not.
You can't
Well,
not
you just have to ask yourself, what is my goal here? What
Yep,
do I want to have happen?
yeah.
And
And just closing thoughts, if somebody was wanting to start a hyperlocal podcast, what would 3 tips be?
build your first 50 guests, write them down, and start reaching out and let them know you're on my list. Tell them point blank, this is happening. And pre-build the content. Because if you can get a list of 50 people, that's a year. You've got your first whole year worth of guests. And you know ahead of time where you're going. And the second thing I would say is you've got to build systems in. Work is going to get in the way, family is going to get in the way. You have to schedule it ahead of time, block it ahead of time. Think about how is someone going to get to record with you. Get a calendar, set it up, get a Calendly, automate it, get a link. Everything needs to be super easy for your guest to fill something out. Get a guest information form built in. Think of it like any other marketing funnel. You want your guests to go through a very simple, easy to use funnel where they give you their headshot, they give you their bio, they give you the links that they want to share about their company, their whatever. Anything you can do before you launch to make it as easy as possible to just walk in, press record, do your thing, and then be done and move on to the next thing. The more thought you put into process, the more successful the podcast is going to be. Because I mean, think about it. How many podcasts have you seen that don't last 20 episodes?
Oh, most.
A lot. A lot, a lot, a lot.
Yep,
People that are friends of mine, people that started a podcast, and I'm like, I don't know. I don't
yep.
know. I really like you. You're a good person. I don't know if you're a podcast host. I don't think you're a podcast host." And what do you know? They get 8 episodes in, and then they just quietly fade away like a fart in the wind.
Yep. And I did that when I did my first podcast. Yeah, I we didn't launch until I had 20 in the can and
Nice.
ready to go before I even hit start. And even that then I was like, this is a lot. And I didn't have I didn't have a budget to go hire a production. I had to it was I got to do it all myself.
Sorry.
Sorry. Oh, you're good.
Instead of peeing on the pee pad, my dog is eating the pee pad.
Oh, the joys of pets and kids.
Ugh,
Um,
sorry.
no, and I have been on and I've been on 9, 10 podcasts so far to
Yep.
as a guest, and, the ones that have all those components, David Carruthers, his podcast process is yep,
Right, come on,
same.
focus camera. There you go, right there.
Yep, yep. Yeah, having well, and collect all of it, the whole process is yeah, is perfect,
Yeah,
so,
David's
you
buttoned
will
up
get an
in a
email after these with that same thing.
yep.
I did it post episode. But yeah, that's yeah, those are great tips. Now if anybody wants to follow along, where can they find you?
Just search Agency Freedom or, the McKinney Podcast on any platform. We're on all of them, all the major ones.
Cool. Well, we'll link to those and hopefully somebody gets a value out of that and kind of goes. And dude, I think the local podcast is there's so much room for opportunity there. I know several agents who have local podcasts and
Mhm.
they do great. And,
Yep,
like, when I talk to them and ask them about it, they're like, "Oh, yeah. We get this," and they're not getting business from the people they're interviewing, but they're getting people that they get stopped in the grocery store. They get, "Hey, I need to talk to you about my insurance." They get calls. "Hey, I
yep.
heard this podcast, or I saw this YouTube video. I saw the Facebook post." And it's something other than boring ass insurance content.
Yeah. I mean, it really is, and, the people who listen to insurance podcasts are a special kind of insane. Is we don't get enough of it in our own agencies. We listen to other agencies talk about insurance too. Yeah, it's and
Yeah.
I'm guilty. I do the same thing. I listen to 3 or 4 insurance podcasts that I regularly listen to because 'cause they're friends of mine. Um, but we're kind of twisted. We're kind of weird as a group and, insurance, principals and producers. We should probably seek therapy and counseling.
Well, James, I really appreciate you taking time out of your day. Enjoy your weekend.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.